Picture this. Up to half of all power line workers in some towns never came home, killed by thousands of volts or by falling from a wooden pole, simply because safety rules did not exist. Denim shirts, hemp ropes, uninsulated steel tools were, for many, their only shield against death every single day. Why did so many accept these odds, and how did anyone survive? The reality you are about to see is far more dangerous than history admits. At the base of every pole, a lineman's world began with a handful of tools and whatever clothing he wore out the door. A wooden ladder, rough and splintered, was the first step up, its rungs cut from pine or fir, already weathered by rain and sun. In dry conditions, wood offered some resistance to electricity, but after a storm, it could conduct a deadly current as easily as any wire. Hemp rope, thick and scratchy, was coiled at the worker's feet. It served as lifeline, hoist, and sometimes the only thing keeping a man from falling. But hemp absorbed water, swelling and weakening with every downpour, and when wet, it too could betray a climber, slipping through calloused hands or carrying a faint, lethal charge. Belts and harnesses, if used at all, were fashioned from stiff leather, buckled around the waist. These early body belts were designed to steady a worker, not to stop a fall. There was no backup line, no modern fall arrest system, just a single strap, often frayed, expected to hold a man's full weight if he lost his grip. Sharp steel gaffs strapped to heavy boots would bite into the pole. The boots themselves were plain leather, offering no insulation from electricity, only a thin barrier against splinters and nails driven into the wood. Tools were simple and unforgiving. Steel pliers, open-end wrenches, hand-forged knives. None had insulated handles. When a tool slipped, it could bridge a live wire and the worker's body in an instant. In rain or fog, the risk multiplied, steel and water making a perfect path for current. The clothing was ordinary: denim shirts, wool coats, canvas trousers. No rubber gloves, no hard hats, no arc-resistant jackets. Every layer could soak up moisture, turning a lineman into a conductor on a wet day. There was nothing between flesh and thousands of volts but the hope that wood stayed dry and hands stayed steady. These were the tools and garments that stood between a worker and the raw power overhead. With each climb, the limits of leather, wood, and rope became a matter of life and death. At the top of every pole, the threat was not just gravity or splintered wood, it was the invisible charge humming overhead. Early distribution lines in American cities carried 2,000 to over 13,000 volts. These were not the gentle currents of a household lamp, but raw energy strong enough to jump gaps in the air and stop a heart in an instant. Power lines ran above crowded streets and factory yards, feeding 110 or 220-volt service wires below, and the top crossarms always carried the most dangerous load. Crews were expected to work with the electricity flowing. Shutting off a feeder could plunge whole neighborhoods or factories into darkness, so repairs happened. Live. Unlike today, there were almost no switches out on the line. Isolating a section meant blacking out entire districts, sometimes for hours, and the pressure to keep circuits energized was relentless. A lineman might be sent up a pole with nothing but a hand tool and a warning to be careful, knowing the wires beside him were carrying thousands of volts. No one could see the danger moving through those copper strands, but every tool and every drop of sweat became a possible pathway for current to reach the body. The lack of insulation did not just make accidents possible, it made them inevitable. Even a small slip could bring skin or steel into contact with a live conductor. In wet weather, the risk doubled as moisture lowered resistance and allowed current to arc farther than expected. The air itself could become a bridge, unleashing a flash of heat and light that burned skin and clothing in an instant. Working live was not a rare exception, it was the rule. The grid's design left little choice, and the consequences were often fatal. Every climb into a 2,200 or 13,000 volt system was a gamble against an enemy that could not be seen or heard, only felt in the split second when a hand or tool completed the circuit. A novice helper stands at the foot of a pole, eyes fixed on the veteran above, who moves with practiced confidence. But even the most experienced lineman can't see what's hidden inside a piece of porcelain. On the crossarm, each wire is anchored by an insulator, usually a pale, bell-shaped block of glass or porcelain, meant to keep the deadly voltage from leaking into the wood or the worker's body. In theory, these insulators are the first line of defense. In practice, they are a quiet source of danger. Tiny cracks, invisible from the ground, can run through the porcelain. Some are left over from the factory. Some form after years of freeze and thaw. A hairline fracture can fill with water, turning the insulator into a conductor the next time it rains. When that happens, the entire crossarm can go live, electrifying every bolt and bracket a lineman touches. Nobody teaches a new hand how to spot a bad insulator. There are no formal schools, no textbooks or diagrams. Most linemen learn by watching and copying the man ahead of them. If a helper asks about the dark streak on a porcelain cap, the answer is usually a shrug or a joke. Just keep your gloves dry, if gloves are even available. When an insulator fails, it gives no warning. Sometimes there is a sharp crack and a burst of white light. Sometimes there is only a faint hiss as current finds a new path. The result can be a fatal shock or a fall as the startled worker loses his grip. Manufacturers rarely admit to defects. If a lineman dies, the blame often lands on his supposed carelessness, not on a cracked insulator or a brittle crossarm. The real risks are hidden, both in the equipment and in the way knowledge is passed down. For every visible hazard, the swaying pole, the bare wire, there is an unseen threat waiting in the material itself. The line between safety and disaster is as thin and fragile as the glaze on a porcelain shell. No federal law protected linemen in the early 1900s. There was no national agency to set rules or inspect work sites, no government office to enforce safety on the poles or in the streets. The Occupational Safety and Health Act would not exist until 1970. Until then, electrical workers operated in a void, with no standardized requirements and no oversight beyond what a company might decide for itself. States sometimes passed factory inspection laws, but these focused on mines, railroads, or large industrial plants. Utilities and electric companies often slipped through the cracks. Municipal ordinances did exist, but their attention was fixed on issues like where a pole could stand or how wires crossed a street. The safety of the men who climbed those poles was left to chance or to the shifting priorities of private companies. Even where a state issued rules for factories or mines, electric line work was rarely included. In most cities, the only written guidance came from the power companies themselves, internal work rules not enforceable by any outside authority. Unions like the IBEW began to push for safer conditions, but without government backing, their demands had little force. A company could ignore them, and many did. If a lineman died, there was no federal investigation, no penalty for unsafe practices, no requirement to change anything for the next worker. The absence of a referee meant that every decision, whether to buy safer equipment, to allow live line work, to provide gloves or belts, was driven by cost, by speed, and by the company's own tolerance for risk. Accident records, when kept at all, were usually private. There was no national database, no coordinated system for tracking deaths or injuries on the lines. Families who lost a breadwinner had few legal options. Workers' compensation laws were just beginning to appear in a handful of states, but most linemen's families faced a future with no support, no recourse, and no answers. In this regulatory vacuum, accountability was elusive. The men who risked their lives daily did so knowing that, officially, their safety was no one's responsibility but their own. Keeping the power on was a matter of pride and profit for utility companies in the early 1900s. Blackouts were not just technical failures, they were public embarrassments splashed across city newspapers. A single outage could bring streetcars to a halt, shut down factories, and leave entire neighborhoods in darkness. For company managers, the cost of lost service meant angry customers, canceled contracts, and pointed questions from city officials. Every hour a line sat dead was money slipping away, and the press rarely let the public forget it. Headlines called out every blackout, framing them as evidence of mismanagement or weakness, while editorials praised the brave lineman who restored light and order to the city. The financial pressure to keep circuits energized was relentless. Utilities faced stiff competition and thin profit margins, especially as electric service spread into new neighborhoods. Insurance companies, too, watched accident payouts climb but rarely forced real change. Premiums might rise after a death, but the cost was still less than the price of regular shutdowns and lost business. Compensation for injured workers or their families was limited, often capped by company policy or the earliest state laws. For most families, a fatality meant a small lump sum, if anything at all, and a quiet burial. The real financial risk lay in service interruptions, not in the loss of a worker's life. Public opinion, shaped by newspaper stories and company advertising, largely accepted these risks as part of modern progress. Linemen were cast as heroes, men who risked everything to bring light and power to the city, their deaths mourned but rarely questioned. Editorials described fatal accidents as tragic but inevitable, the price of building a new world. Calls for reform were muted, drowned out by stories of restored service and the promise of a brighter, electrified future. In this environment, the drive to keep lines live and to keep the public's faith in the miracle of electricity overrode almost every safety concern. The system depended on risk, and the public narrative made it seem both noble and necessary. In city union halls and rented backrooms, linemen gathered to talk about what was happening on the poles. By 1907, the stories all sounded the same. Another man dead, another family left with nothing but a pay envelope and a funeral bill. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, just over a decade old, started to take a harder line. Local delegates drafted resolutions demanding that companies supply rubber gloves for every job involving live wires. Some wanted even more, rules that would force employers to take responsibility for safety, not just speed. The first glove campaigns did not start with speeches in Washington or full-page ads. They began as handwritten motions at local meetings, passed around on scraps of paper. In Boston and Chicago, union minutes from 1908 and 1909 show members voting to refuse work on energized lines unless gloves were provided. These were not empty threats. In some towns, crews walked off the job after another electrocution, refusing to climb until the company agreed to supply gloves or better belts. Gloves became a simple, direct demand. Employers pushed back, accusing the union of trying to slow down the work. Company foremen claimed that gloves made men careless or clumsy, arguing that a good lineman does not need rubber between his hands and the wire. Some managers went further, blaming accidents on worker negligence, not on the lack of equipment. Union men countered that no amount of skill could protect bare skin from 2,200 volts in a rainstorm. In union newsletters, delegates wrote that a glove was cheaper than a coffin and asked why the company could afford to string new lines but not to keep its workers alive. By 1910, the debate was spreading. Safety resolutions from local unions made their way to national conventions, where delegates argued over the best language and the hardest demands. The push for gloves was just the start. Soon, calls for better belts, standardized training, and accident reporting would follow. But the first fight was simple: no more climbing live wires without a layer of protection. The union's voice grew louder with every death, and the refusal to accept the old risks became a rallying cry for change. Rain hammered the city, turning every wooden pole into a slick, treacherous climb. On storm days, the job did not pause. Outages spiked, and crews were dispatched before dawn, boots sinking into mud, hands numbed by cold. The records from Boston in March 1902 show a cluster of fatalities. 8 linemen dead in just 2 days, each sent up to repair ice-laden wires that sagged and snapped under the weight. They climbed 30, sometimes 100 feet, with nothing but a hemp rope and a leather belt, the wind rattling the crossarms above. Falls were a constant threat, but in storms, they became almost routine. A single misstep on a rain-slicked gaff, a boot slipping on ice, or a rope that snapped after soaking overnight, any of these could send a man plunging to the cobblestones below. Crew logs from New England list names in the margins: O'Rourke, Jensen, Taylor. Each entry carries a short note: fell from pole, 42 feet, lost footing, rain, crossarm broke, fatal. The heights were unforgiving. A fall from 30 feet could break a leg or a back. From 60 feet, it was almost always fatal. In winter, the numbers spiked. Ice storms left poles coated in glassy armor, and the weight on the wires pulled hardware loose without warning. Insulators shattered under the strain, and when a crossarm failed, there was no second chance. Patterns emerged in the accident reports. Most deaths came during or just after storms, when urgency overrode caution and every climb was a gamble. For linemen in 1902, the weather was not just an obstacle, it was a deadly partner, and the odds of survival tilted with every drop of rain or flake of ice. Inquest records from the early 1900s read like a ledger of routine loss. After a lineman's fatal fall or electrocution, the coroner's jury gathered in a back room, heard brief statements, and wrote a verdict in careful script. Death by accidental means while engaged in the duties of his employment. The wording rarely changed, no mention of faulty insulators or rain-soaked ropes, just the bland assurance that no one was to blame. Sometimes the company sent a manager to confirm the man's name and years of service. The jury nodded, signed the page, and moved to the next case. For the families, the aftermath was anything but routine. Widows wrote formal letters to the union or the company, each one a plea for help. "I am left with 3 children and no means of support," began one petition to the IBEW Benefit Fund in 1908. The benefit list in the union ledger was stark: a name, a date, a sum, sometimes enough for a burial, rarely more. In some cities, the widow's only recourse was to ask the company for a small pension or to take in boarders. The coroner's verdict closed the official file, but the hardship carried on in kitchens and cold water flats across the city. In the eyes of the law, these deaths were accidents. For the families, they were sentences handed down by a system that measured loss in paperwork and silence. Every power outage today is restored by workers whose lives are safeguarded because others once paid the ultimate price. Even now, line work ranks among America's most dangerous jobs. Fatality rates are still over twice the national average. Progress is always built on risk, but true advancement means not forgetting the cost. The wires above us carry more than current. They hold the memory of every life spent making them safer.